All right, thank you, and thank you to the International Studies Program for hosting me and for Professor Brunstetter for putting this together. I'm really excited to be back in California. This morning it was snowing and they had to de-ice my plane in Chicago, so it's nice to escape that as it's happening. So I want to start by proposing a question to you all. If I were to talk about corporations and ask you what you think if I say the term corporate or private sector, what's the first thing that pops into your head? And you can just shout it out. Profit? What else? Office? Like stuffy, maybe? Especially on this glorious day here. What else? Organization? Big business? Corruption? Wall Street, what? Somebody said something about globalized. Anything else? Job. All right, strategic for you. Okay, so most of these terms that you guys are saying aren't necessarily positive, right? I mean, you think about maybe corporate greed. You think about kind of a stuffy office setting. You think about things like profit thinking or being profit-oriented. What if I were to ask you what kind of activities you associate with the private sector when it's operating in failed states or in areas where the countries are developing, where the government can't enforce the rule of law? What kind of activities do you think of corporations doing there? Exploiting? Go ahead, just shout it out.
Creating a market.
Creating a market? Somebody else had something. Bribes? Maybe corruption? Okay. So a lot of the things you guys are talking about is where corporations might be taking advantage of a system where the government isn't able to enforce rules, isn't able to create the setting, the laws that are going to protect people, okay, and create peaceful societies. So we might think about corporations as playing unfair, or playing by their own rules and taking advantage of the local population when the rule of law isn't being enforced. Would you believe me if I said that this is something that's changing? If I said that the private sector might actually be able to help us build peaceful societies? So we all have stories, and we're going to talk about some of these stories, where corporations have done really horrible things in developing countries. But what I want to leave, or what I hope to leave with you today, is the concept that there's a possibility that the private sector might actually be partners in building peaceful societies. Okay? And you can think of some kind of current event examples where corporations have stepped up to try to create a system of justice. So we've all observed kind of the actions and reactions of the current administration in corporations like Google and Starbucks, and how they've reacted to President Trump's travel ban. Okay? So we might start to see that the private sector can be more fully engaged in this process. Okay? And I'm going to give you some examples today of where corporations have been really proactive in the peace process in countries that have been struggling with civil conflict. And I want to make an argument today that it's not only possible, but it might actually be necessary for the private sector to kind of shift in the way that they interact with local populations, okay? And it's likely that we're going to see changes in the nature of US government engagement globally. And I think we're seeing that with the recent budget proposal. So this means that we need to think really creatively about who are the actors that can be involved in building peaceful societies. All right, and so today I'm going to be presenting some kind of early stage research on what it is that the private sector is doing to help promote peace in these developing countries. Okay, so I want to start out by talking very broadly about what are the actors that would be interested in preventing and resolving conflict. So there's a lot of research out there on this. One of the earliest arguments that's kind of the basis of why war occurs talks about how war actually isn't in the interest of either party, okay? War is costly. It would be much better off if countries could just come to agreement without having to fight that war, okay? And so we first of all know that it's actually in the interests of warring parties to come to an agreement, if they can, without going to war, without suffering the cost of war, without foregoing other opportunities, all right? And so a lot of research builds on this concept and talks about why it is that countries and subnational groups are unable to come to agreement without going to war. And so some of my own research highlights the outside actors that have an interest in resolving conflict. So this is third-party conflict resolution. So we know that states are much more likely to help resolve international conflicts when they have ties to the disputants. However, that said, states have tight budgetary constraints, okay? They have opportunity costs. They're going to forego other opportunities of involvement to help resolve a dispute that isn't their own, okay? And it's not always going to be in their interest to do so. In addition, we know that international organizations often have missions that are based on the idea of peaceful conflict resolution. But once again, these international organizations face very tight budgetary constraints, okay? So they're often not able to be involved either at all or to the extent that they would like to be. So what about the actors that are financially invested in the states that are involved? Well, these invested organizations are the private sectors, okay? So we know that the private sector can really suffer financially if there's a violent conflict that occurs, okay? We've observed attacks that have damaged infrastructure, and this leads to loss in profits. We also know that corporations can benefit if they have stronger ties to a country, okay? So when they have stronger ties, they have happier employees. Profits go up. We also know it's a lot easier for them to market their company if they have a positive image. There are also things called ethics that we might talk about, okay? And so there might be a moral obligation for these companies that are invested to behave in an ethical way. Finally, we also know there's a lot of external pressure on these companies to get involved. I'm sure many of you deleted Uber, okay? And so this is that kind of external pressure that pushes companies to behave in certain ways, okay? And can affect the corporate behavior of executives and their firms. So you guys aren't alone in your distrust of corporations. This distrust is actually very warranted, okay? So there are lots of different examples of companies that have done really bad things. Most recently, we've observed in Colombia, Del Monte, Dole, and Chiquita, among a bunch of other private corporations, were recently charged with hiring militias during the Colombian Civil War, okay? And the Colombian case is something we're gonna come back to in a minute. So there's lots of different examples of where corporations have instigated violence, have profited from violence, and have helped to escalate conflict and tensions that are already in place, okay? So I want to acknowledge this and say that this is a very horrible thing, okay? So you guys are with me on that. But I want to push the possibility that there might be another side to this coin, And that's what we're going to explore today. So corporations also have a lot that they can gain in these environments. And they're going to lose if they don't engage. And so what we're observing, and what I've been studying over the last few years, is this idea that corporations are starting to think about the importance of stability where they operate. So yes, they can profit from instability, but they can also profit more from stability. It's in their interest to have stable societies. So some of the stuff that I'm observing is almost every large corporation has a corporate social responsibility program, okay? Some of them just have a web page about the awesome stuff they're doing. Some of them have much broader and more empowering programs. Many corporations also set up separate foundations, okay? So they'll have a foundation that they set up that acts as a separate entity that benefits some cause, okay? And we'll talk about some examples of those in a minute. If you guys go out and get your MBA after this, God help you, you will have to get training in corporate social responsibility. You will take ethics classes, okay? So we're starting to think about how we train our private sector leaders. And then finally, there are lots of different non-governmental organizations and other international organizations that have been established with the sole purpose of helping private sector businesses operate in conflict-prone environments. International Alert, the United Nations Global Compact are just a couple of different examples of organizations that have the sole purpose of helping these private sector organizations operate in an ethical way. That said, we don't talk about the things these guys are doing in the peace and conflict literature, okay? And so I'm just going to pick on my own research because I know that I'm guilty of this, okay? So, and I think this is true of most conflict scholarship. Most conflict scholars are really interested in what states are doing, because if you've studied realism, that's the most important actor in international relations, right? But also, what is it that regional organizations are doing and international organizations? Sometimes we talk about the role of individual mediators. Very rarely we talk about non-governmental organizations. Never do we talk about private organizations. Okay? So we're very interested in kind of the main IR actors as we see it, but who the main IR actors are is changing. Political economists take a very broad approach to this problem, okay? So we talk about the commercial peace. Countries that trade together are less likely to go to war with one another, okay? But we don't really delve into why this is. It's a much more broad-based approach. Business scholars are talking about this concept, but in much more theoretical terms, okay? So they have a host of theoretical frameworks for how corporations can act in these environments. What we don't know is what they're actually doing, okay? So what I'm observing is that there's this major shift going on in the way that corporations are responding to international conflict and domestic conflict, okay? So a lot of times we've talked about, and as we started today discussing, corporations can exacerbate tensions, okay? They can profit off conflict and often have. However, what we're seeing is an increased involvement of the private sector in peacemaking. Some business scholars talk about the possibility here as corporate actors creating value through things like helping to enforce the rule of law, engaging in track 2 diplomacy, so this is like unofficial diplomacy, community building efforts, and I'll give you guys some examples of these in just a minute, but a host of different ways that companies can offer to help build much more peaceful societies. So this is all a lead up to my research question, which is acknowledging the bad things that corporations have done, can they do good things? Okay? So do corporations create value beyond what is their normal economic exchange? So is there some kind of value added that's not just adding to the GDP of a country? Okay? Are there kind of good things that companies can create that aren't just normal exchange? That said, if this is possible, which companies are the ones that are doing this? So how can we understand why some companies are willing to engage in peace-building activities while others aren't? So what are the characteristics of the companies that work to build peace in their countries? Okay, I'm just putting this up here so you guys think I'm smart. Okay? I'm just going to say that. So this is all I'm going to tell you about my theory, and I'm going to explain every little piece of this to you, and it's going to be super easy. Okay? So the chapter that I'm kind of building this from is based on this idea that corporations are selecting which programs they want to do and how they want to spend their money in terms of what is the expected value of that activity, okay, or the expected utility, okay? So using this expected utility logic, I argue that the utility or the value of some program is going to originate from whatever the value of that program is times the possibility or probability that it's going to be successful, that it's going to have the desired outcome that they want, minus whatever the cost of that program is. Okay? And so we're going to go through these, and I'll give you some examples of these as we move forward. So first of all, let's talk about the utility of peace building. Okay? So utility is just like a fancier way of saying value. So what's the value of peace building to a company? Okay? So if you're a private company, what is the use of engaging in peace building instead of engaging in something else? Okay? Why would you do this? So this has to do with whatever the risks are from engaging in this activity, and how important is this to you? Okay? How important is building a peaceful society to your company? And this has two different sources. First of all, you want to protect your investment. Okay? So if you're a transnational corporation, it is easy for you to leave a country when things go wrong. Okay? I'm not talking about transnational corporations. What I'm going to be looking at and talking to you guys about today is locally owned and headquartered businesses. Okay? It's hard for those guys to leave. Okay? So if you're headquartered in a country and things go south or become much more unstable, it's very hard for you to leave. Okay? And oftentimes there are certain sectors of the economy that you can't leave. It's impossible to leave, even if you're huge. Okay? Even if you have lots of money. Second of all, the value you have for peace building is in influencing the conflict environment. Okay? So how important is it to you that you have a say in that outcome? That you're a part of what the negotiations look like. Okay? And there are cases where business leaders have actually been at the table when conflicting states and conflicting parties are negotiating the terms of their peace accords. Okay? And so is it important to your company that you're involved in that peace process? Do you want to influence that agreement? So I have a couple of expectations that I derive from this. First of all of this has to do with how tied you are to the country where you're operating. Okay? Do you have really strong ties? Well, the companies that are going to have the strongest ties to the countries where they're operating are the really big firms. Okay? So I expect that really big firms, and the bigger they are, the more interested they are in protecting their investment, the more resources they have to put into this, so the more likely we are to see these actors engaged in peace building. That said, yes, small businesses do amazing things at the local level, okay? But it tends to be in kind of local projects that aren't going to affect major party negotiations, okay? Medium and small enterprises do important work, but it's not at this high level of negotiations. And the larger a company is, the more likely we are to see it engaging. Second, I expect that certain companies have a really important culture of peace building, of community engagement, and this really stems from the top down. Okay, so there are certain CEOs that find community engagement to be a really important part of the operations of their company, and they're going to make sure that these types of activities happen. Okay, so this is kind of a top-down culture that values engagement. Finally, I expect that companies that are operating in the natural resource sector are more likely to be involved in peace-building activities. And that's because they can't leave. Okay? So we all know stories about natural resource sector, extractive industries that have done bad things. Okay? You guys have probably watched Blood Diamonds, for example. Okay? And this has led to public backlash. And these companies need to be able to get these resources out of the ground, and they can't go elsewhere for them. So that's led them to have to think creatively about engaging the societies where they're operating. Second, I look at the cost of peace building. Okay, so because you don't have to do this, because companies aren't required to engage in the societies where they're operating, they have to be willing to forego other opportunities, okay? They have to be willing to give up investing in a new market. They have to be willing to absorb the costs of these peace-building activities. So I expect that nearby events are going to increase the likelihood that these companies are willing to absorb these costs, okay? So when there's violence near your company, suddenly this is really important to you, okay? Then finally, I look at how likely it is that your efforts are going to be effective, okay? And so the probability that these efforts are effective really has to do with the setting, the environment where you're operating, okay? So what does the environment where you're operating look like, okay? What does that country where you're conducting business look like? How stable is it? And I focus here on what we refer to as the capacity of the country. Okay, so what is the government's capacity to enforce the rule of law? And I argue, so in low capacity states or almost no capacity states, these are failed states. Okay, these are states where sovereignty can't be enforced, where the rule of law is not being enforced. You're not going to have corporate investment in these countries, okay? Peace building or otherwise. So we're unlikely to see any kind of activity from corporations in low capacity states. But in moderate capacity states, there's a lot of room for the private sector to do important work. And so we're going to see a spike in moderately capacity states. But this levels off as that capacity gets high. So as the government is able to provide all services, there's less need for private sector investment, okay? So I expect this kind of a quadratic relationship here. Okay, so to kind of sum up my argument, we're going to see firms engaging under a few conditions. When they're big, when they have a culture that values peace building, when they work in the extractive sector, when there's stuff happening near their company, and when they're in a moderate capacity state, okay? So let's run through an example. So let's talk about Colombia. Colombia is just such an interesting case for this stuff, okay? Long, ongoing civil war since the 1960s. How many of you guys have watched Narcos? Like half of you? Why aren't you watching Narcos, guys? It's so good. That is only a little slice of the picture of the violence that's happened in Colombia since the 60s, okay? So for those of you that have seen it, it's horrifically violent, okay? Tragic what has happened in Colombia, okay? And that only looks at the narcotics sector. It doesn't look at what FARC has done, what ELN has done, okay, what the militias have done, okay? Over 220,000 casualties in Colombia since the 60s, okay? In December, the peace accord was passed with FARC, and now the government's currently negotiating with ELN. the other group that's been causing a lot of violence and is still causing a lot of violence, unfortunately. Okay, the private sector has suffered enormously from this violence. In terms of GDP, Colombia has lost an estimated 3% a year. In 2014, there was an estimated $500 million lost in revenue from oil due to bombings. That was in 2014. That's as this has become a less violent conflict. Okay? And so what this has led to is a very engaged private sector. Okay? It's in their interest to be engaged. And bombings, kidnappings, extortion has made this in the interest of the private sector. So this conflict has been very costly for the private sector. Colombia is a moderately capable state. Okay? The rule of law is pretty much enforced, okay, but not always. Okay? So it's not considered a high capacity state. It's one of the kind of average capacity states by a bunch of different measures that we can talk about if you guys want. Okay, so I want to talk about a specific company in Colombia, Promigas. And so Promigas is one of the largest companies in Colombia. It operates in the natural resource sector. It's a gas and energy company, and it has a really strong culture of peacebuilding. And we'll talk about some of the different examples of the way they've engaged as well. So what do we see in terms of my expectations? Okay, the value of peacebuilding. Well, they have a large income, okay? Over 526 million in revenue reported for 2015, okay? Huge income, very large company, very important to Colombia's GDP. They have this culture of engagement. So in 2014, they signed on to be a member of the United Nations Global Compact, okay? And this is a compact that requires all signatories to produce evidence and write in annually about what it is they're doing to help sustain peace in their country, okay? And so this tells us a little bit about the importance of peacemaking in the company culture of Promigas, okay? Like I said, they're working in the extractive sector, so they're a natural gas and energy company. The cost of the conflict to Promigas has been really high. So they regularly have had their pipelines bombed. As recently as 2 weeks ago, they had a pipeline bombed. So this has been really a costly conflict for them, and Colombia somewhat able to enforce the rule of law, but not completely high on the capacity. So what are they doing to build peace in Colombia? Well, in terms of the social engagement element, kind of a sidebar, I'm going to be looking at different elements of peace building. So socially, they're building peace through a bunch of different foundations. Okay, so they have Fundación Promigas is kind of their external foundation that they have set up on their own, and they have partnered with a bunch of different NGOs in the area. And so one thing that they're doing is focused on training and educational opportunities. So they've provided an estimated 41,000 educational opportunities for people to get training, excuse me, that they wouldn't otherwise have access to. Okay, so that's a huge thing that they're doing socially. Economically, they have partnered with an organization called Global Partnership on Output-Based Aid and established 35,000 new natural gas connections in rural households. Okay, so having access to natural gas has dramatically improved the lives of these people and is considered to be an economic peace-building activity. These different activities that they've engaged in, and these are just a couple of highlights, has led to them to be commended at the 2010 World Business Development Awards ceremony, and they're considered to be kind of one of the forerunners in Colombia in terms of the peace-building activities that they've been involved in. So now that we have this example, let's talk about data on this stuff. So we have kind of one case, but kind of where does that fit into the broader picture? So this has been where I've been spending a lot of my time, is in trying to understand how we might understand a bigger picture of what's going on in terms of corporate investment in peace building. So I've been collecting data over the last 3 years on firm-led peace building activities. So this data I'm calling in the company of peace and conflict. And what I've been coding is news reports of operations by private sector firms that either help build the economy beyond GDP, okay, so things like the natural gas connections that I just mentioned, or helping build up society through educational programs, like I just mentioned that Promigas is doing, or through environmental programs. And we see a lot of environmental programs going on as well. So it's 3 different types of activities that I'm looking at. So this is an example of one of the conflict narratives that I've written about Promigas. And so I'm not going to have you read all this, but it gives you kind of an idea of what it is Promigas is actually doing, okay? So I have one of these I've coded for all of the major firms in Latin America and the Caribbean, looking at what is it that the company is actually doing and looking at outside reports of what they're doing. Okay, so Promigas is coded in the raw data as having revenue of over $500 million. They have a foundation. They're a member of the UN Global Compact. They've added social value. They've added economic value. They have not added environmental value. Okay, so I've done this for 325 corporations in Latin America and the Caribbean. Okay, I'm only including companies that have at least 100 million in revenue. That's because this is where the information is available. I would love to have small businesses in here, but that information just isn't available. Okay, so this is what I can get access to. And what I've observed is of these 325 corporations, 98 of them have created social value, 80 of them have created economic value, 79 of them have created environmental value. Okay, so of these cases, approximately 60% of them are creating some kind of value in terms of peace building to the areas where they're operating. All right, so the value in terms of adding to society, you will notice for all of these charts, there's a really large bar by the 0 number, okay? So the majority of companies aren't doing anything in any one given sector, okay? So social value, we get about 100 out of 325 are creating social value, okay? So adding somehow to the educational or society elements. In terms of environmental value, around 80 of the 325 cases are adding to the environmental element of a society. And then in terms of kind of outside economic value added, around 80 as well. So if we looked at kind of the combined contributions, so if we combine these 3 different measures of peace building activities, we get about 60% of the firms doing something, okay? So which firms are doing something and which firms aren't doing anything? Okay, who are the good guys and who are the bad guys? We want to know. First of all, the more money you make, the more likely you are to do this kind of stuff, okay? So like I explained to you before, when you have something to invest, you're more likely to be prone to invest it. If you've established some kind of outside foundation, you're much more likely to be engaged, okay, to partner with other foundations, okay, to work with NGOs, to work with international organizations in doing this type of stuff. Interestingly, if you've signed on to be a member of the UN Global Compact, it doesn't matter, okay? That doesn't have an influence over what you're doing. Extractive sector corporations are much more likely to engage in peace-building operations. And finally, firms that are operating in moderately capable states are more likely to engage in peace-building. So let's look more specifically at these relationships. For stats people, this is results from negative binomial regression. Okay, so what does this look like if we were to plot it out? Okay, so what this tells us is kind of skewed on this. I don't know why it looks different from my, yeah, I didn't correct for West Coast here. So what you have here is the income of the company and how many peacebuilding activities you're likely to engage in, okay? And so the darker blue is if you're operating in the extractive sector, and the lighter blue is if you're operating in some other sector, okay? So what you can see is as income goes up, so the more money your company makes, all of these companies are engaging in more peacebuilding activities. However, if you're in the extractive sector, you're even doing more. Okay, so the dark blue dots are higher than the light blue dots. Those that have a culture of peacebuilding, okay? So if you have some kind of foundation that you've established, you're much more likely to engage in peacebuilding, okay? And this is even a stronger relationship than the earlier one I just showed you. Here's the state capacity measure, okay? So as the country where a firm is operating becomes more capable of enforcing the rule of law, we get this kind of petering off effect, okay? So here, no capacity states, no peacebuilding activities. As it goes up, more peacebuilding activities, but that kind of tapers off, okay? So as the rule of law becomes increased, we get a tapering off effect. To be sure, the very purpose of a private firm is to create profit. And a lot of times what we observe, especially in failed states where the government cannot enforce the rule of law, we see corporations are giving profits precedence over people, okay? So we see companies doing really horrible things in terms of destabilizing society, in terms of taking advantage of people, okay? However, we're also starting to see a shift in this, okay? We're also starting to see some firms are engaging society beyond kind of traditional economic transactions, and they're starting to do more things that actually in the long run benefit them more than destabilizing a country, okay? They're much more likely to engage in peace-building activities like investing in a society, okay? Investing in the environment of a country, investing in the economy and helping to build that economy in a positive way. And that these things actually lead to long-term profits. So it can actually benefit the company more if it behaves in this way than if it behaves in a worse way. So I want to kind of end with this idea that we're kind of operating in weird times right now, right? So US global partnerships and US foreign policy is really unclear and unstable right now. And what US interactions with other countries looks like is very unsure, okay? The new Secretary of State said that the US might not guarantee a peace agreement in Colombia, okay? Which the US has always said it would back some kind of agreement in Colombia. So it's very unclear what the US foreign policy is going to be. So we need to start thinking creatively about who are the actors that can help engage in peace building, okay? And how we can engage both the public sector and the private sector in these types of activities. And I think it's in the interests of all of us, including private sector actors, who have both the interest and the resources to contribute to peacekeeping and building peaceful societies more broadly. Okay, so I'll stop there and I will take any questions that you guys have.